Salem was a rigid Puritan community. Life was strict, deeply religious, and filled with fear of the devil. In January 1692, Reverend Samuel Parris's daughter and niece began to suffer from violent fits, screaming, contorting, speaking in strange voices. With no medical explanation, the town turned to the supernatural. The whispers began. Witches. Once the accusations started, they spread like wildfire. Neighbors turned on each other. Old grudges became deadly weapons. Within weeks, respected women like Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne were dragged before the court. They were questioned harshly, and every stumble, every word, was twisted into proof of guilt. By the summer, the panic consumed the town. Over 200 people were accused of practicing witchcraft. Some were chained for months in freezing prisons, unable to pay the heavy fines demanded for their release. In the end, 20 people were executed. 19 were hanged on Gallows Hill. One man, Giles Corey, was pressed to death with heavy stones for refusing to plead. But here's the chilling part. The evidence used to condemn them wasn't physical. It was based on dreams, visions, and bizarre so-called tests. Imagine being tied up and thrown into water. If you floated, you were guilty. If you sank, you were innocent. But you drowned. The Salem Witch Trials remind us of the danger of fear and mass hysteria, how quickly suspicion can destroy lives. In Salem, being accused of witchcraft meant one thing: you couldn't win. The court used twisted tests to prove guilt. But every test was designed for only one outcome: death. By 1692, fear ruled Salem. Judges believed they were fighting the devil himself, so ordinary rules of evidence no longer applied. Instead, they turned to superstition and torture disguised as tests. These methods were accepted by the courts, and they sealed the fates of hundreds of accused men and women. The most infamous was the swimming test. The accused was bound and tossed into water. Puritans believed pure water would reject evil. If the person floated, they were guilty. If they sank, they were innocent. But unless rescued, they drowned. Either way, the test ended in tragedy. Another method was the touch test. Victims who claimed to be afflicted by witches' spells would fall into fits. If their fit stopped when the accused touched them, it was seen as proof of guilt. Imagine being dragged before neighbors, knowing that even their trembling could damn you. Perhaps the most dangerous was spectral evidence. Witnesses claimed they saw a witch's ghostly figure or spirit tormenting them in dreams. This so-called evidence was invisible to everyone else, yet it carried enough weight to send people to the gallows. These tests weren't about truth. They were about fear, control, and a system designed so no accused witch could ever escape alive. And the first to face this deadly cycle was Sarah Good, a poor, outspoken woman with few friends. In part 3, we'll step inside her trial and hear the damning words that sealed her fate. She was poor, she was defiant, and she had no friends to defend her. In Salem, that was enough to be branded a witch. Sarah Good was one of the first accused in 1692, and her tragic story shows how fear and prejudice fueled the hysteria. Sarah Good lived on the margins of society. She had little money, often begged for food, and carried a reputation as argumentative. In a deeply religious Puritan town, where women were expected to be submissive and silent, Sarah stood out, and not in a way that earned her compassion. So when Reverend Parris's daughter and niece began their strange fits, and the first accusations of witchcraft spread, Sarah Good quickly became an easy target. Neighbors testified that when Sarah begged and they turned her away, she would mutter curses under her breath. Others claimed livestock sickened after she passed by. In a time of fear, every misfortune became proof of witchcraft. The court leaned heavily on so-called spectral evidence. Witnesses insisted they saw Sarah's spirit tormenting them in dreams. Though no one else could see it, the judges believed the visions were real. And most chilling of all, her young daughter, Dorcas, just 4 years old, was questioned. Terrified, she confessed under pressure, saying her mother was indeed a witch. The child's testimony sealed Sarah's fate. In July of 1692, Sarah Good stood trial. She denied the charges, declaring her innocence. But in a court ruled by fear, her words carried little weight. On July 19th, Sarah Good was led to Gallows Hill alongside 4 other women. When offered one last chance to confess, she refused. Instead, she turned to Reverend Nicholas Noyes, who had condemned her, and declared, "You are a liar. I'm no more a witch than you are a wizard. If you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." It was a curse that would haunt Salem for years to come. Sarah Good was hanged that day, remembered not as a witch, but as one of the first innocent victims of mass hysteria. Her story reveals how society's most vulnerable, the poor, the outspoken, the powerless, were the easiest targets. By the end of the trials, 19 people had been hanged and hundreds more accused, and the nightmare was far from over. In part 4, we'll look at one of the youngest accused witches, a child caught in the hysteria. Her trial shows just how far Salem's madness reached. She was just 4 years old, the youngest accused witch in Salem. Her name was Dorothy Good, and her story shows how fear consumed even the most innocent lives. In 1692, accusations spread like wildfire through Salem. No one was safe, not the elderly, not the poor, not even children. Dorothy was the daughter of Sarah Good, one of the first women arrested. When the judges demanded testimony, they turned to the smallest witness of all, Dorothy herself. Terrified, confused, and only 4 years old, Dorothy said she had seen her mother with the devil. It's likely she repeated what she was told to say, words forced from a frightened child. But the court seized on her testimony. Then, in a cruel twist, the suspicion turned on Dorothy herself. Other children claimed they saw her spirit tormenting them, and so even this little girl was declared a witch. Dorothy was sent to prison, a place of filth, chains, and fear. Records describe her shackled for months, her small body confined among adults awaiting execution. Imagine a 4-year-old, locked in darkness, hearing the cries of the condemned. Though she was eventually released, Dorothy was never the same. Reports say she lost her reason, her mind broken by the trauma. The Salem Witch Trials had scarred her forever. The story of Dorothy Good reveals just how deep the hysteria ran. Even children became victims of a system that fed on fear. But how could Salem keep executing neighbors, friends, even children? In part 5, we'll uncover the turning point, when the madness began to At first, Salem believed the hysteria. The trials consumed the town, neighbors turned against each other, and the gallows filled. But by the autumn of 1692, cracks began to form. The very people who fueled the frenzy suddenly found themselves in danger. The accusations had spread beyond the poor and powerless. Now, respected church members, landowners, even town leaders were being named as witches. The trials, once seen as righteous, began to feel dangerous, even to those in power. The breaking point came when accusations reached the highest levels. Governor William Phips had allowed the special court to carry out the witch trials, but when his own wife, Lady Mary Phips, was accused of witchcraft, the tide turned. The governor suddenly questioned the evidence that had seemed so convincing before. If even his wife could be called a witch, then no one was safe. Attention turned to the use of spectral evidence, claims of ghostly visions seen only by the accusers. Ministers, judges, and townspeople began to admit the obvious. These visions could not be proved. Without them, many cases collapsed. The same leaders who had encouraged the trials began to quietly distance themselves, questioning whether the court had gone too far. By late 1692, the executions slowed. Juries refused to convict, judges began reversing sentences, and Governor Phips, desperate to end the chaos, dissolved the special court entirely. The panic that had once burned like wildfire now sputtered into ash. The Salem Witch Trials were collapsing under the weight of their own injustice. But even as the executions ended, the scars remained. Families were left broken, reputations destroyed, and the community haunted by what it had done. When the executions ended, Salem was left with something far heavier than gallows or chains. It was left with guilt, and the struggle to live with what the town had done would last for centuries. By 1693, Governor Phipps dissolved the special court. The hysteria had ended, but the damage was already done. Over 20 people were executed, including those who maintained their innocence until death. More than 100 languished in prison, their families ruined financially and socially. Almost immediately, families of the accused began demanding justice. Ministers and judges who had once stood proudly by their verdicts now faced scrutiny. The colony declared a day of fasting and soul-searching. Judge Samuel Sewall, one of the main magistrates, publicly confessed his guilt in church, begging God's forgiveness. Some families were granted compensation. Convictions were slowly overturned, but not all. For decades, descendants lived with the stain of the word witch attached to their names. Even Sarah Good's curse seemed to linger. The reverend she damned with her final words later died, choking on his own blood. The aftermath left Salem haunted. Land disputes arose where victims' property had been seized. The town's reputation was scarred. The trials became a symbol of how fear and superstition can destroy communities from within. But the story doesn't end there. Salem's trials became more than local history. They became a warning carried forward through American culture. The Salem Witch Trials ended in 1693, but their legacy never truly faded. For more than 300 years, Salem has stood as a symbol of fear, hysteria, and the terrible cost of injustice. In the centuries that followed, the trials became infamous. Writers, historians, and politicians have turned to Salem whenever society has faced its own waves of fear. In the 1950s, Arthur Miller's play The Crucible used Salem as a warning against the McCarthy-era witch hunts. Salem itself transformed. What was once a scarred community is now a place of remembrance and tourism. Museums, memorials, and historic sites draw thousands every year. The names of the victims are carved in stone, a permanent reminder of lives destroyed by fear. But the legacy is not just cultural, it's legal and moral. The Salem trials are taught in classrooms as a case study in mass hysteria, wrongful convictions, and the dangers of relying on unverifiable evidence. Modern legal systems point to Salem as the reason due process and the presumption of innocence are so vital. The Salem Witch Trials may feel like distant history, but the questions they raise are timeless. How easily can fear spread? How fragile is justice when truth is clouded by panic? That is Salem's legacy, a story of tragedy, but also a warning to every generation. This concludes the Salem Witch Trials series. Follow for more dark history, where the past still haunts the present.